James Hong is one of the most enduring faces in Hollywood history, with a career spanning more than 7 decades and more than 600 roles, ranging from film and television to voice acting, a number that very few actors can reach. He appeared in classic films such as Blade Runner and Chinatown, and left a deep mark with his role as Lopan in Big Trouble in Little China, a character that became a pop culture icon. Not stopping at acting in front of the camera, he also lent his voice to the famous animated series Kung Fu Panda as the character Mr. Ping, bringing warmth and humor to millions of audiences around the world. In 2022, after more than 60 years of dedication, he was officially honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a belated but meaningful recognition. That same year, his role in Everything Everywhere All at Once helped him become known to a new generation of audiences and contributed to the film winning many prestigious awards, including victory at the Oscars. Besides his acting career, he was also a co-founder of East West Players, the oldest Asian American theater organization in the United States, opening opportunities for many later generations of actors. But behind those impressive numbers and proud milestones is a very different story, a journey not laid with a red carpet, but built with silence that stretched for decades. While others are remembered for just one role, he had to go through hundreds of roles that no one called by name, standing in the light but not being seen, existing in the center of the industry but always on the edge of recognition. There was no explosive moment, no distinct peak period, only continuation, day after day, year after year, like a quiet affirmation that he would not disappear. His pain did not lie in losing everything, but in never having enough. And it was precisely in that emptiness that his will became clearer than any award. A person who was not remembered at the right time, but still chose to stay, still continued to work, still walked through nearly a century without giving up, until the world finally turned back and realized that he had always been there. Before we move forward, please hit like and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the story of the man who lived an entire life in the light but was never truly seen. But to understand why a person can exist for nearly a century and still feel he does not belong anywhere, we must go back to where everything began. Not the lights of Hollywood, not the films, but a child born into a world that had unintentionally placed him on the side from the very first days. James Hong was born into a Chinese immigrant family in the United States, a family that carried hopes for a better life, but also carried gaps that were not easy to fill. It was not a childhood full of tragedy in the way people usually tell. There were no big shocks or violent events, but there was something quieter, more persistent, a feeling of being lost that crept into every day, every moment, as if he was always standing between two worlds without truly belonging to either. On the outside, he was an American child who spoke English, growing up among the streets and schools of America. But in the eyes of society, he was still someone different, someone not completely like them, a face that made others notice the difference before they had time to listen to anything he wanted to say. And inside the family, where it should have been the only place of belonging, he grew up among traditional values, unspoken expectations, a world where identity was tightly preserved but did not help him easily integrate with the outside. And so he grew up between two cultures, but was not truly accepted fully by either side. No one told him he did not belong, but no one made him feel he truly belonged either. His family was not a place that nurtured artistic dreams. They had no map for Hollywood, no stories about stage lights, no one who said he could become an actor. What they had was diligence, long working days, the desire to survive and find stability in a country they were still trying to understand. In such an environment, the future was not something to dream about, but something to be practical about. No one sat down and asked him what he wanted to become. No one drew a clear path, and no one said he had the right to dream bigger than what was in front of him. And so he grew up without a specific direction, not because he lacked ability, but because no one showed him that another path existed. Those years were not loud. There were no memorable moments to recount, but that very quietness carried its own weight. At school, he was not the center of any group. He was not completely excluded, but he was also not truly welcomed. He existed there, just as he would exist in most of his later life, present but not stand out, there but not noticed. The other children might not realize it, but he felt it, little by little, through glances, through invisible distance, through the times he was not called by name, and gradually he learned not to demand to be seen. No one taught him to be silent, but he learned it. No one told him to adapt, but he understood that if he did not, he would be left behind. He observed, he listened. He adjusted himself to fit the environment around him, not to stand out, but to exist. And it was precisely in those years that a part of who he was took shape, not through affirmation, but through restraint, not through a loud voice, but through persistent silence. It was the kind of growing up that no one paid attention to, with no achievements to record, no milestones to celebrate, but it affected his entire later life. Because when a child grows up without truly feeling he belongs anywhere, he learns to carry that feeling with him throughout life, stepping into every space with an invisible distance, standing in the crowd but always holding back a part of himself. And perhaps it was from those days when he still did not know who he would become, that one thing had been shaped very clearly. He would not be the first one noticed, not the one with the biggest name, but the one who could exist in the shadows longer than anyone else. A person who learned to stay even when the world around him did not truly see him. And then, when the years of youth gradually passed in that familiar silence, life did not open a clear path for James Hong to walk, but only placed before him safe choices, directions that many people like him at that time were forced to accept. He did not grow up with the dream of becoming an actor, did not have evenings sitting in front of the mirror practicing lines, did not imagine stage lights or applause. Instead, he chose a more stable, more practical path, a path that his family could understand and accept, where the future was measured by certainty rather than vague things. He studied engineering, a choice that reflected his exact circumstances, a choice that caused no controversy and posed too many risks, as if his life from early on had been directed to stay away from dreams without guarantees. But sometimes life does not need a big decision to change direction, only a quiet enough moment for another door to open, and he stepped into acting in that way, not because it was something he had been waiting for, but because it was something that appeared by chance. There was no long-term plan, no clear goal, no one standing behind to say he should do this, only a small opportunity, a small role, and a somewhat hesitant decision. He stepped into that world not with the confidence of someone who knew where he was going, but with the caution of someone who was not sure he should even be there. The first roles came quietly, just like everything else in his life. There was no attention, no words of praise, no sign that this would be the beginning of something bigger. He appeared in small roles, sometimes nameless, characters that existed just long enough to complete a scene and then disappeared, just like he did in the memory of audiences. No one waited for him, no one placed expectations. And that was both a relief and a hard-to-name emptiness. When no one believes you will succeed, you also have no reason to believe you can become anything else. In those years, the industry did not open its arms to welcome him, but only allowed him to stand on the edge. Close enough to participate, but not close enough to truly belong. Big opportunities did not come, important roles did not appear, and every step forward was so small it was almost impossible to notice. He worked, continued to take roles, continued to appear, but there was no moment that made him stop and think he was on the right path. Instead, there was a quiet feeling that he was pursuing something that had never truly belonged to him. A path he walked but did not feel connected to, as if he was living in a role that had gone on too long without a clear script. There were times when the question appeared, not in words, but in feeling. Whether he should stop, whether he should return to a more stable life where everything was easier to understand, where he did not have to continue existing in this uncertainty. But life does not always offer clear turns. There was no other opportunity waiting, no easier path to go back to, and so he stayed, not because he was sure this was what he wanted, but because there was no clearer choice. And then, day by day, year by year, staying became a habit, just like the way he had learned to be silent since he was a child, just like the way he had learned to adapt to the gaps that no one else noticed. He continued to act, continued to appear, continued to go through roles that no one remembered, not because he believed that one day everything would change, but because he had grown used to not needing that change to continue. And it was precisely in that uncertain continuation that something was gradually forming. Not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. A person who could stay in a world that had never truly called his name. A person who could keep walking even when he did not know where that path would lead. And then, when the first years in the acting profession had passed without leaving any clear trace, James Hong began to face a reality that no one said outright but was present everywhere. A reality that he was not chosen, not because he lacked effort, not because he was not capable enough, but because there were doors in this industry that had simply never been opened for people like him. The auditions took place, the fleeting opportunities, the vague promises, and then everything ended in silence. There was no explanation, no clear rejection, only the phone not ringing, only the times he was not called back, only the fact that his name did not appear on the final list. And gradually, he understood that there were ways of being eliminated that did not need to be put into words, ways that made a person disappear from opportunity without leaving a trace. In an industry where everything seemed to revolve around opportunity and attention, he stood in a position where opportunity was always out of reach. The roles with depth, the central characters, the stories where he could truly express himself, all belonged to others. What was reserved for him were the small pieces, the roles written in a mold he could not escape, the characters created not to be understood, but to fill a gap in the script. The mysterious Asian man, the waiter, the elderly person with the distinctive voice, the images repeated so often that they became the default definition of him in the eyes of this industry. He had no chance to prove that he could do more than that. No one gave him a role big enough for him to fail, because from the beginning he had not been allowed to try, and that created a loop he could not escape. When you are not given the opportunity, you cannot prove yourself. And when you cannot prove yourself, you are even less likely to be given the opportunity. The years passed in that loop, with no explosion, no turning point, only the repetition of what had already happened, as if his life was held at a point where it could not go any further. There were times when the silence became heavier than any rejection. Because when someone says no, at least you know you were seen, you were considered, you were put into a choice. But when there is nothing at all, when there is no call, no response, no sign that you ever existed in their thoughts, that is a deeper form of elimination, a form that makes you wonder if you were really there from the beginning. And, for him, that was not a rare experience but a prolonged state, a familiar part of life that he had to learn to accept. Time did not make everything easier. It only made the truth clearer. He began to realize that he was not only trying to move forward, but also trying not to be pushed back. Every role he received was not a big step forward, but a way to keep existing, a way to keep himself in the industry without being completely eliminated. And gradually, the concept of success changed. It was no longer about becoming a star, no longer about landing a big role, but simply about being allowed to keep working, about being allowed to keep appearing, about being allowed to keep being there. There was a quiet pain in knowing that you could do more, but no one asked you to. No one looked at you and said you could be the center of a story. No one believed you could carry a film on your shoulders. And when that repeated long enough, It no longer remained an external doubt, but began to become part of the way you saw yourself. He did not say it out loud, but he felt it through every role, through every missed opportunity, through every year that passed without change. And then something happened quietly, not on a specific day, but through many years of accumulation. He began to accept, not accept in the way of giving up, but accept in the way of adjusting expectations, shrinking the dream to fit reality. He no longer waited for a role that would change his life, no longer placed hope in a big opportunity that would appear, but only focused on continuing, on doing the best with whatever he was given, no matter how small it was. That was not an easy decision, but it was a necessary one to survive, because when you are not recognized at your true value for a long enough time, you have to find another way to define your own value. And for him, that value did not lie in recognition, but in endurance, in the ability to keep moving forward on a path where no one promised anything at the end. He was not chosen, not prioritized, not given big opportunities, but he was still there, still continuing, still appearing like a quiet affirmation that whether this world saw him or not, he would not disappear. And when that acceptance gradually became part of the way he existed, James Hong's life stepped into a stage that lasted longer than anyone could imagine. A stage where everything no longer revolved around achieving something grand, but simply around continuing to work, continuing to appear, continuing to exist in an industry that had never truly made room for him. Those years had no climax, no clear turning point, only the steady repetition of work. Day after day, project after project, like a circle with no beginning and no end. He took a role, completed the role, then moved on to another role. Not because it was a big opportunity, but because it was the only way to maintain his life. More than 7 decades passed as he appeared in hundreds of films and television shows, a number that would surprise anyone who looked at it. But behind that number was a truth rarely mentioned. Most of those roles were small, short, and easily forgotten. He stepped into the frame, said a few lines, fulfilled his part, and then left, leaving behind a character not big enough to be remembered, not deep enough to leave a mark. Those roles were not wrong, not bad, but they were also not enough to change the way the world saw him. And so he became a familiar part of the film industry. A face that audiences might recognize in the moment but could not hold in their memory for long. There was a paradox that existed throughout his career. The more he worked, the more invisible he became. Each new role did not bring him closer to recognition, but only added to the long list of appearances that no one remembered. While other actors needed only one role to change their lives, he needed hundreds of roles just to maintain his presence. And even then, that presence remained fragile and easy to forget. There was no film where his name was the reason audiences went to the theater, no character tied to him long enough to become iconic, only a long chain of fleeting moments following one another, creating a career that existed but had no clear shape, and that gradually shaped the way he saw himself. When you have no role to be proud of, no big success to hold on to, you begin to measure your value in a different way, not by fame, but by the ability to keep working. For him, being called into a project, no matter how small, was enough to keep moving forward, not because he did not long for more, but because he understood that in his circumstances, simply existing was already not easy. There were days he stood on set, surrounded by actors who were called by name, noticed, surrounded by the crew and glances, while he stood there, quietly doing his part, not demanding, not expecting, as if he had grown used to that position for a very long time. No one asked what he thought about the role, no one discussed his character, and when the scene ended, he left without leaving a clear mark in that space. But the next day he came back again, continued again, appeared again, as if the only important thing was that he was still there. Gradually, one thing became clear. His career was not built on peaks, but on the accumulation of small things. Roles no one remembered, appearances no one mentioned, moments not big enough to become memories, and because of that he existed in a very special state, both a part of the industry and not truly belonging to it. He was present in film history, but not recorded clearly by name. He contributed to films where others were honored, but he himself stood outside those recognitions. Perhaps the hardest thing was not working a lot without recognition, but realizing that no matter how much you do, it does not change the way the world looks at you. But he did not stop. He did not leave. He did not look for an easier path. Instead, he continued doing the only thing he had grown used to, continuing to work, not because he believed tomorrow would be different, but because he had grown used to not needing tomorrow to be different in order to continue today. There is a kind of persistence that does not come from belief in the outcome, but from not knowing what else to do. And he seemed to belong to that kind of persistence. He went from one project to another, from one role to another, not with the hope that each time he would get closer to something big, but simply in order not to stop. While others measured their careers by success, by awards, by fame, he measured his by continuation, by the fact that he was still there, still being called, even if only for the smallest roles. But precisely in that continuation, another paradox gradually became clear. The more he worked, the more he realized that the distance between him and what he could have achieved did not narrow, but seemed to grow farther. Not because he stepped back, but because the world around him moved faster, and each step forward by others only highlighted his stillness even more. That did not make him stop, but it also did not disappear. It existed as a familiar feeling, a part of life that he carried without needing to name it. And then, amid all of that, he still continued. There was no big change, no different result, no sign that everything would suddenly turn in another direction. But he still worked, still appeared, still went through each day with the same rhythm he had grown used to for a very long time. Not because he did not see what was happening, but because he had accepted that his life might not resemble the stories people usually tell about success. And in that acceptance he did not find comfort, but found something else, an ability to keep walking forward even when there was no guarantee that the path would lead somewhere else. And then, when the years continued to pile up on one another, one thing gradually became undeniable in James Hong's life. He was not the person audiences never saw, but on the contrary, he was the person they had seen too many times, only they had never stopped long enough to remember. He appeared in big films, works that film history still mentions, stood in the same frame with prominent names, contributed to stories that audiences loved. But when the lights went out and the memories were kept, his name was not in them. He was not absent. He had never been absent, but his presence passed like a background element, enough to complete the picture, but not enough to become its center. There were moments when audiences saw him and felt familiar, a vague feeling that they had seen this face somewhere, in some film, in some scene, but when they tried to call the name, they could not. The name did not come, the memory was not clear, only an unexplainable feeling of familiarity, and that created a very special form of existence. He was not a stranger, but he was also not someone remembered. He existed in the space between recognition and forgetting, where familiarity was not enough to become memory. Over the years, he became a familiar part of the film industry, a face that directors could trust to fill necessary roles, a person who could always appear on time, do the part, and then leave without disrupting anything. He was a part of the system, a steadily working gear in a large machine, but not the part that people look at when they want to understand how that machine operates. And that was both a quiet recognition and a limit that could not be crossed. There was no role tied to his name in the way people could say that was his own character. There was no moment when audiences could point to and say that was when he was truly seen. The characters he portrayed all fulfilled their function, all contributed to the story, but they did not stay long enough in the viewers' minds to become icons, and over time that was no longer a coincidence. but became a rule, something repeated so often that it seemed impossible to change. His continuous presence did not lead to lasting recognition, but instead seemed to make the feeling of invisibility clearer. Each new appearance was not a step forward, but a repetition of his position in the industry, a position that did not change, did not shift, did not expand. He was everywhere, but there was no place that truly belonged to him. He passed through films, shows, roles, but left no mark deep enough to keep him in the memory of others. And perhaps the hardest thing was not being unnoticed, but knowing that you had been seen, yet still not remembered. It was a very small, but very deep kind of distance, where you almost touched recognition but never truly had it. He was not standing completely outside the game. He had been in it for a very long time, but his position in that game was always on the edge, always in the back, always in the place where the light did not shine long enough. The passing years did not change that, but only made it more familiar. He no longer waited for a role that would change everything, no longer hoped for a moment that would make things different, but continued to work in the exact position he had grown used to, as if that was the only place he could stand. And in that continuation he became an indispensable part of the stories others told, but had no story that truly belonged to himself. The more he appeared, the feeling of invisibility did not disappear, but became clearer. Like a truth he could not avoid, he was not removed from the industry, not completely forgotten. But he also never stepped out of that gray area to become a name mentioned with certainty. And it was precisely in that state that a person continued to live, continued to work, continued to exist among millions of glances without any glance truly stopping on him. And when that invisibility became a familiar part of his career, it also quietly spread into James Hong's personal life, as if he was not only unseen on screen, but also chose to be unseen in his own life. He did not appear in tabloids, was not tied to noisy stories, had no attention-grabbing headlines, and over time, that silence was no longer accidental, but became a choice, a way to exist without having to face pressures he had never truly belonged to. In an industry where private life is often exposed as part of fame, he stood outside, kept his distance, as if he understood that there were things that, if they could not have the light, also did not need to endure its price. His family existed in a similar way, not as a story told many times, not as an image built for the public, but as a part of life that happened behind what others could see. He built a stable family, a private space he could return to after working days. But that was not something the world knew about or cared about. There were no photos appearing in the press, no stories told in big interviews, only a life that took place in silence, just like the way he had lived most of his life. And perhaps that was exactly why what he had in his private life did not become part of his public image, but existed only as something private that he kept for himself. But that quietness did not mean there was no price to pay. When most of the time was spent on work, when each day passed in one project after another, personal life gradually had to adapt to the rhythm of the profession. There was not always a choice between work and family, and many times continuing to work was not because of ambition, but because it was the only way to maintain existence in the industry. The long days on set, the periods away from home, the moments when he could not be there, all did not create big stories, but accumulated into small gaps. Things left unsaid, but still existing. There were no standout moments in his private life for people to remember, no big events to define his personal life. And that was exactly what made everything even harder to see. His life had no clear highlights, no milestones that people could point to and say that was when everything changed. Instead, it was made up of similar days, small choices, unnamed sacrifices, things that if not looked at carefully people would think had never existed. And perhaps what made those sacrifices heavy was not the sacrifices themselves, but the fact that they were not recognized. No one stopped to see what he had given up. No one asked what he had traded to continue, because from the outside his life had nothing worth questioning. He was not a big star, had no fame to protect, had no image to maintain, and therefore what he sacrificed did not become part of the story people told about him. Gradually, he accepted a quiet life in an industry that was never quiet. While others chased the lights, attention, and peaks, he followed a different path, not because he did not want those things, but because he understood that his life was not designed to achieve them in the usual way. He did not fight against that, nor did he try to change it forcefully, but learned to live with it as a natural part of his life. And it was precisely in that quietness that one thing gradually became clear. He was not only a person who was not seen, but also a person who did not demand to be seen. He did not build an image, did not try to attract attention, did not try to turn himself into something else. He simply continued to live, continued to work, continued to keep what belonged to him without needing to bring it into the light. But even though he chose silence, that did not make what he had been through any lighter. The passing years still carried gaps. The sacrifices were still there even if no one mentioned them, and his life continued in a way that very few people truly understood. A life that was not loud, not brilliant, without moments that made people stop, but long enough for the small things to accumulate into a story that, if looked at deeply enough, people would realize that silence is sometimes not a sign of absence, but a sign of something that had existed for too long without anyone noticing. And then, after all those years of silence, a different feeling began to form in James Hong's life. Not loud, not clear, but deep enough that he could not ignore it, a feeling that he had never truly reached a point that could be called enough. Not failure, because he was still working, still existing, still present in the industry for many decades, but also not success in the way people usually understand. Because there was always a small, very small distance between where he stood and where real recognition began. Throughout that journey there had been opportunities that came close, close enough for him to see them, close enough for him to believe that this time it might be different. But then they passed by, not disappearing completely but only shifting to someone else, the roles with potential to become turning points, the projects that could bring his name into the light, all stopped at a boundary he could not cross. And what made everything heavier was not that those opportunities did not exist, but that he had touched them, but never kept them. He was always in the intermediate position, not the person standing completely outside, but also not the person at the center. He was chosen to participate, but not chosen to lead. He was present in the story, but not the one telling that story. And that position, repeated over many years, gradually became an unchangeable part, as if his life had been shaped to always stop right before stepping into something bigger. There was a very hard-to-name feeling in always missing that final step. It was not explosive disappointment, not pain that made him collapse, but a prolonged kind of emptiness, a feeling that even though he had gone very far, there was still something missing for everything to become whole. And when that feeling stretched over many years, it was no longer a moment but became a state, a part of the way he saw his own life. The efforts he put in were not small, but the results did not change in the way people expected. He worked more, appeared more, contributed more, but all of it seemed only to help him maintain his current position rather than take him further. That did not make him stop, but also did not bring change, and that very repetition created a quiet kind of fatigue, not physical, but emotional. There were times he looked back and realized he had done almost everything an actor could do, had appeared in enough kinds of roles, had gone through enough projects, but still had nothing big enough to define him. There was no role that when mentioned people would immediately think of him, no moment he could call a peak, and that did not come from a lack of ability, but from never being placed in a position to show that ability fully. Living with the feeling of never being enough was not easy, but he had no choice but to carry it. It did not disappear with time, did not lessen with more experience, but only became more familiar. Like a part of life he no longer needed to question. He no longer wondered why he had not achieved something bigger, but accepted that his life might not be measured by clear milestones like others. And it was precisely in that acceptance that he continued to move forward, not because he believed that one day everything would change, but because he had grown used to not needing that change to continue. He did not look for a big turning point, did not wait for a final opportunity, but only continued to work, continued to appear, continued to keep himself in the game, even if that position was not where he could have once hoped. But that did not make the feeling of incompleteness disappear. It was still there, in every role, in every passing year, in every moment when he realized he had come very close to something, but still was not enough to touch it. And perhaps that very feeling, stretching through almost his entire life, was the biggest price he had to pay. Not losing everything, but living with never having enough. And then, when the feeling of never being enough was no longer something new, but had become a familiar part of life, James Hong stepped into a stage so long that even he could hardly clearly distinguish where it began and where it ended. A stage where time did not bring change, but only extended what had already existed. More than 40 years passed, a number large enough for a person to build, lose, and rebuild many times. But for him, it was not a chain of upheavals, but the continuation of a nearly unchanging state. His career continued, roles still came, work did not stop, but there was no turning point big enough to create a clear difference. There was no moment he could look back on and say that was when everything changed. There was no film where his name became the reason audiences remembered, no role big enough to be tied to him in the memory of the film industry. What he had was a long chain of small contributions, parts completed fully, but not enough to be recorded as milestones. And when there were no milestones, life gradually became hard to measure, with no reference point to look back on, no clear signs to determine how far he had gone. Time, in his case, was not something that accumulated value in the usual way. For many people, the longer they worked, the more opportunities they had to be recognized, to be mentioned, to become a clear part of history. But for him, time seemed to do the opposite. Each year that passed did not make his presence clearer, but instead made it fade in the flow of new faces, new stories, new successes. He did not disappear, but he gradually became obscured, like an image standing in the back where the light did not shine long enough to keep it. His contributions were not small, but they were not recognized in a proportionate way. He was present in important films, contributed to stories where others were honored, but his part in those stories was not mentioned much. He was not removed from history, but he was also not placed in a position where people could easily see him, and that created a very hard-to-name feeling. A feeling that he had done so much, but what he did was not recorded in a way that others could recognize. The silence was no longer a stage, but had become part of life. It no longer surprised him, no longer made him ask questions, but became something familiar. A state he carried without needing to think about it too much. He did not wait for change, did not expect a turning point, but continued to live in that very silence as a natural part of the journey he had chosen, or perhaps had been placed in. There are people who go through difficult years and then step into a brilliant period, but for him, those years did not lead to an explosion, but stretched into a straight line with no clear peak, no specific ending point, and that was exactly what made everything harder to notice, because when there is no sudden change, people easily overlook what happens slowly, little by little. He continued to work, continued to take roles, continued to appear, not because he did not recognize that silence, but because he had learned to live with it. There was no big resistance, no decision to leave, only continuation, a form of persistence that did not need to be explained. And perhaps it was precisely in that continuation that he kept something not everyone could keep, a persistent presence that, even if not clearly seen, still did not disappear. But that did not make the silence any lighter. It was still there, in every passing year, in every role not remembered, in every moment when he realized he had traveled a very long distance without a clear milestone to mark it. And perhaps that was exactly what made his story different. not because of what he had achieved, but because he had continued through years where nothing changed, without stopping, without disappearing. And then, when the silence that stretched through many decades was no longer a stage, but had become the default state of life, James Hong began to step into an even harder-to-grasp period, not because too many events happened, but because almost nothing happened big enough to keep him in the memory of the world. New generations of audiences appeared, grew up with new faces, new stories, new films, and in that flow, what belonged to the past was gradually pushed back, not because it had no value, but because it was no longer repeated. He was still there, still continued to exist, but the distance between him and the public's attention grew larger, as if time not only passed but also carried away what had once belonged to him even farther. The roles he had once taken part in, even though so many they were hard to count, were not kept in the collective memory in the way people do with great icons. They did not disappear completely, but gradually became faint, lying in corners that only those who really searched could see. There was no character mentioned often enough to pull his name back, no image strong enough to overcome time and stay in the minds of many generations. And when memories are not repeated, they gradually turn into things that no longer exist, as if they had never clearly existed from the beginning. His name did not appear in the lists people usually use to define film history, did not lie in the big discussions about influential actors, was not mentioned as an indispensable part of the industry. That did not mean he was not present, but that his presence was not placed in a position where people could easily see it. He was not removed from the story, but also not retold as a central part of it. And that was exactly what made his existence more fragile over time. Like a small line of text gradually fading on a page that few people still open. Gradually he became a name left behind, not because he had left, but because the world had continued forward without carrying him along. The people he had once worked with, the films he had once participated in, all were still there, but not enough to keep him in the main flow of public memory. And when no one mentioned him, when no one called his name, a person could exist for a very long time without truly being recognized. His career, though long and persistent, was not preserved in a clear way, the way people reserve for big names. There was no simple story to summarize his journey, no single milestone to represent the entire career, only a long chain of small moments, short roles, unremarkable but continuous contributions. And because of that dispersion, his story became hard to grasp, hard to retell, and easy to overlook in summaries of history. There was a hard-to-accept truth that gradually emerged, not through a big event, but through time, that he could be completely forgotten, not immediately, not in one moment, but gradually, through each year, each generation, each time he was not mentioned. And that did not come from him doing nothing, but from the fact that what he did was not kept in a way that others could see. But even when facing that risk, he still continued. He did not stop to demand recognition, did not try to change the way the world saw him through loud methods, but kept the familiar rhythm of his life. Continued to work, continued to appear, continued to exist in a space where attention became increasingly distant. Perhaps he understood that not everyone is remembered, that there are people who pass through life without leaving a clear mark in the collective memory, but that did not make him abandon his path. And perhaps it was precisely in that continuation, amid the risk of being completely forgotten, that he kept the only thing no one could take away, his own presence. Whether the world remembered or not, whether his name was mentioned or not, he was still there, still existing, still a part of the story he had gone through, even if that story might not be told in the way people usually tell about others. And it was precisely in that existence that another paradox appeared, that a person could be forgotten in the memory of the world but still not disappear from his own life. And then, after all those years that seemed to have passed in silence to the point of being irreversible, something unexpected began to happen with James Hong. Not a sudden change that overturned everything, but a slow, late attention that came at a time when even he perhaps no longer expected it. When age had reached a number where many people had stopped long ago, when most of life had been lived in a state of not being fully recognized, the world suddenly turned back and began to see him, not as a fleeting face, but as a person who had always been there, but had never been called by name in a deserving way. That attention did not come from a strategy or a calculated move, but from the final roles of his life. Moments when he appeared no longer like a background element, but began to be recognized as a meaningful part. Those roles did not change his past, did not erase the long years of being overlooked, but they were enough to make audiences stop longer, enough for them to ask a question that had not been asked before. Who is this man? And why do they feel like they had seen him somewhere from a very long time ago? For the first time in many decades, familiarity no longer ended in forgetting, but led to recognition. What had previously been only a vague feeling now began to take shape, to have a name, to have a story. And in that moment, he did not change. But the way the world looked at him began to change. What he had done for so many years no longer passed quietly, but began to be connected into a journey, a story that people could look back on and understand that it had existed for a very long time. The honors that came after that were not like a reward for a recent success, but like an acknowledgement for an entire life that had unfolded without being recorded at the right time, when his name was engraved in places he had never been thought of before, when he stood in moments where the light no longer passed over but stopped. All of it carried a very different meaning. Not victory, not a peak, but a belated recognition, a confirmation that what he had done was not invisible, only unseen. But that recognition, even though it brought pride, could not be separated from another feeling. A feeling he perhaps did not need to say out loud, but was still present. Because when recognition comes at a time when most of life has already passed, it is not only joy but also carries a question. Why did it take so long? Why were the things he had done for so many decades only seen now, when the opportunities to enjoy it in the most complete way were no longer many? There was a contrast in that moment between the pride of finally being recognized and the regret of the years that did not have it. He did not go back to change the past, could not recover the opportunities that had passed, could not live again the stages where recognition might have brought a different direction. And because of that, the honor was both full of meaning and carried a silence that not everyone noticed. People around could look and see a beautiful story, a long journey finally recorded, an ending that brought a feeling of completeness. But for him, it was not an ending, but a moment at the end of a journey that had gone through nearly his entire life. And in that moment, he did not become a different person, did not suddenly change his position in history, but was simply seen more clearly, called by name more clearly, after so many years without that. And perhaps that was exactly what made his story special, not because he was finally recognized, but because he had gone through nearly his entire life without that recognition and still continued. The late attention did not erase what had happened, but it illuminated something that few had realized before, that there are people who are not seen at the right time, not called by name at the right moment, but are still there, still continuing, until the world finally turns back and realizes that they had always been present. And then, after all that had come late, after the moments when the world finally turned back to look at him, the life of James Hong did not stop there, did not close with a clear ending point, but continued to flow on, slowly, quietly, in the way it had always unfolded for nearly a century. At the age of 97, a number that for many people marks the end of every journey, he was still here, still existing, still being mentioned, not as a great symbol of brilliant success, but as a person who had gone through time without disappearing. When looking back at his entire journey, perhaps what stood out the most was not what had changed, but what had not changed. The long years he had gone through were not marked by clear turning points, not divided into brilliant and declining stages like many other stories, but stretched like a straight line with no shining peak and no distinct abyss. And that very extension created a very different feeling. A feeling that his life was not defined by big moments, but by continuation through each day, each year, each decade. He was not the person people usually mention when talking about success in Hollywood. His name did not stand in the first position, was not tied to records or big titles, and if looked at from the outside, people could easily think that he had not achieved what many others in the same industry had achieved. But if looked deeper, something else appeared, something that could not be measured by fame or awards, and that was the fact that he was still here after all. Endurance became the clearest feature of his, not something he tried to show, but something formed through time. Through the years when he continued to move forward when there was no guarantee that the path would lead anywhere else. He did not stop when there was no opportunity, did not leave when there was no recognition, did not change his path just because it did not bring quick results. Instead, he kept his own rhythm, continued to work, continued to appear, continued to live in the way he had grown used to for a very long time. There is a very special strength in not leaving, not a strong resistance, but a quiet persistence, a decision repeated every day without needing to be announced. He did not say he would continue, he simply continued. And that was exactly what made his existence different, not because it was loud or standout, but because it lasted longer than what people could expect. At the age of 97, he was no longer standing at the beginning, nor at a new peak, but standing in a very special place where the past was long enough that it could not be changed, but the present was still there to continue. He did not go back to repair what had passed, did not try to redefine his life in a way others could easily understand, but accepted the entire journey as it had unfolded, with all the gaps, the shortages, the things that were not whole. And perhaps it was precisely in that acceptance that he found his own way of existing, without needing to compare with others, without needing to measure by familiar standards. He did not become a typical model, did not represent a traditional success story, but he became something else, a person who still stood there after most others had left, a presence that was not erased by time. He continued to exist in his own way, without needing to change to fit what the world expected, without needing to become a different version of himself to be recognized more. And that was exactly what made his story carry a very different meaning. Not what he had achieved, but what he had kept through all those years. He may not be the most successful person, may not be the one remembered the most, but he is the one who is still here. And sometimes just that alone is enough to say something not everyone can do. A person who did not disappear, did not stop, did not leave, even though the path he walked did not bring what people usually call victory. And in that existence, there is a quiet answer to all the previous questions. That there are lives that do not need to become something grand to have meaning, only need to be persistent enough not to be erased from this world. And then, when looking back at that entire journey from the present point, one thing gradually became clear, not in a loud or easily accepted way, but like a truth that had always been there, but few wanted to face. That James Hong's life had never had a clear victory in the way people are used to defining it. There was no moment when everything stopped and the whole world looked in one direction. There was no time when he was placed at the highest position of the light to be called the one standing at the top. But, at the same time, he was also not a story of failure. Not a person left completely behind, not someone who had tried and could not continue. He existed in a very different place, a place lying between two concepts that people usually use to classify life, not completely successful, but also not able to be called failure. That very space in between is the hardest to understand, the hardest to see, and also the easiest to overlook, because people often look for stories with clear points, with peaks or with collapses, with an ending they can name. But his life did not provide that. It did not offer a simple answer. did not give a clear image that people could grasp immediately. And because of that, for many years, the truth about his journey was not recognized. Not because it did not exist, but because it did not fit the way people are used to seeing the world. The efforts he put in were not small, but they were not evaluated in a proportionate way. He worked more than most others, appeared in more projects, maintained his presence longer, but all of that did not automatically turn into recognition, because in an industry where everything is measured by standout quality, by the ability to attract attention, what he did lay in a different form, a form not easy to see, not easy to measure, and when that stretched long enough, it created a distance between his real value and the way the world saw him. His journey stretched through many decades, long enough to cover many stages of the industry, many generations of audiences, many changes in storytelling. But it lacked a completeness that people usually look for. There was no part of his life that could be separated and called complete, no chapter that could stand alone as a clear symbol. Instead, the whole story could only be understood when looking at the continuity, at the way each small part came together over time. And perhaps that was exactly what made the truth hard to recognize for many years. Not because it was hidden, but because it was not presented in a way that people could easily accept. People looked at him and saw an actor who worked steadily, a familiar face, a long career, but did not stop to ask what lay behind all of that. There was no clear reason for them to stop, no big event to force them to pay attention, and therefore his story continued to exist in a state where no one truly saw the whole thing, only when time was long enough. When what he had done accumulated to the point that it could not be completely overlooked. When the world began to look back and realize that he had always been there, the truth gradually appeared, not as a new discovery, but as something that had existed for a very long time. A person who had gone through nearly his entire life without a clear victory, but also was not defeated. A journey with no brilliant peak, but also no sudden ending. An existence that stretched on and could not be summarized in simple concepts. And when that truth was seen, it did not bring a light feeling, but placed a different way of looking at value, at the meaning of a life. Not every journey needs a moment of victory to become valuable. Not every story needs a peak to be remembered. There are people who live in the space in between, not reaching the greatest thing, but also not falling to the lowest. And that very existence, stretching through time, creates a meaning that is not easy to recognize. James Hong is one of those people, a person whose story does not lie in what he achieved, but in the way he went through everything without disappearing. And perhaps that is the truth that for many years no one really wanted to see. Not because it was not important, but because it did not fit the way people are used to telling about success. And then when everything was put back in its right place, when the light no longer blurred the gaps and time had been long enough for all the outer layers to fall away, James Hong's story appeared in a way unlike anything people usually expect. He did not win in the way the world is used to honoring. There was no moment when everyone had to stop to recognize him as the one standing at the top. There were no big titles to define his entire life, no single role that when mentioned, everyone would immediately remember him. But if looked at long enough, if looked at deeply enough, something else gradually became clear. Not what he achieved, but the way he had gone through all of it. Endurance was not something he declared, but something he lived with every day, in every small role, in every year that did not change, in every moment when he could have stopped but chose to continue. It did not come from an explosive determination, was not a grand promise, but a chain of repeated choices, continuing to work, continuing to appear, continuing to stay in a world where nothing guaranteed he would be seen. And it was precisely in that repetition that something formed, not fame, not glory, but an existence that could not be erased. He did not become an icon in the way people usually define an icon. There was no image of him imprinted deeply in the collective memory as a clear representative of a period, no role mentioned as an irreplaceable standard. But that did not mean he had no value. It only meant his value lay somewhere else, a place not easy to see, not easy to measure, a place where long-lasting presence mattered more than short-term explosion. There were no big victories to recount, no moments he could look back on and say, that was when everything changed. But there was also no point where he was truly removed from the game. He did not fall, did not disappear, was not completely replaced. Instead, he stayed through each year, each decade, through the changes of the industry, through new generations of actors, through trends that came and went. And when looking back, that very staying became the most noticeable thing, not because it was loud, but because it was rare. There are so many people who begin, so many who once appeared, once had opportunities, once were noticed. But not everyone can maintain their presence through such a long time. Not everyone can continue when there is no recognition, no guarantee, no clear signs that things will get better. And it was precisely in that continuation that he did something not everyone immediately recognizes. He did not disappear. That may sound simple, but it carries a very different meaning when placed in the context of his life. Not disappearing is not only about still being alive, still working, but about still keeping his place in a space that is always changing, still existing in an industry where elimination happens continuously. He was not completely replaced, not completely forgotten, even though there were times he stood very close to that boundary. And that was exactly what made his existence a value of its own, something that did not need to be compared with others to be understood. That long-lasting existence was not the result of a single stroke of luck, but the result of thousands of days no one saw, of small choices no one recorded, of moments when he could have left but stayed instead. It was not built in one day, did not come from a single opportunity, but was accumulated through time, through persistence that did not need to be recognized. And when looking back, that very accumulation created something no award could replace. He may not be the person the world mentions first when talking about big names, but he is the person who, if you look carefully, you will realize he had always been there, from a very long time ago. He did not stand in the center of the light, but he also did not disappear into the shadows. He existed in a different place, a place not many people notice but solid enough not to be erased. And perhaps that is exactly what this story wants to keep. Not what he achieved, but the fact that he did not disappear. In a world where everything changes very fast, where names come and go, where attention can vanish after just one moment, existing through nearly a century without being erased has become something rare. James Hong is not a story about a winner, but a story about a person who went through everything without being defeated. He did not stand on the peak, but he also did not lie at the bottom. He stood in a different place, a place with not much light, but solid enough to keep him there. And in that existence, there is a meaning that does not need to be spoken too loudly, a meaning that lies in continuing, in staying, in not disappearing, whether the world sees it or not. The story of James Hong does not make people hurt because of a big event, but makes them pause because of a form of loss that stretched through nearly an entire life, where a person had worked for more than 70 years, appeared in more than 600 roles, stood in films that millions watched, but did not have a single moment that truly belonged to him alone. What hurts me the most is not that he did not succeed, but that he was always very close to recognition, but never touched it, like in the part where he continuously received small roles, appeared and then disappeared, or when he witnessed other actors rise while he himself stayed still for decades. Especially the detail that he was only honored at a very old age shows a hard-to-accept truth, that sometimes society sees a person's value too late, when most of their life has already passed in silence. But it is precisely in that which highlights a rare quality, an almost absolute endurance, when he did not leave, did not resist loudly, but continued to work, continued to exist, even when there was no guarantee that he would be remembered. For the people of the United States, this story reflects a familiar but rarely spoken reality. that not everyone who works hard is recognized at the right time, and not every dream has a clear peak. The lesson does not lie in having to become the most standout person, but in keeping your own value in a system that can overlook you, continuing to contribute even without the light, and understanding that sometimes not disappearing, still standing firm after everything, is already a form of success that not everyone achieves. If the story of a person who has lived nearly an entire life in silence but never disappeared makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way to remember him. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore lives that are not loud but are never erased.